Are you ready for what I have in store for you today? Of course there you are. German humor, I love it. Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and we are back at our friends at the New England Air Museum checking out a fantastic bird right here. This is the F4U-4 Corsair, and it's not just any Corsair, it is literally the first of the Dash 4 series. And we're filming this, of course, at Nîmes in Connecticut, and the Corsair is the state aircraft of Connecticut. There's actually a piece of paper right there that says so. So that's really cool. Best location to film a Corsair, I would say. So let's start up, as always, on the front. Big thank you here to all the patrons and channel members who make Inside the Cockpit 100% community funded. Up front, we have the Hamilton Standard Hydromatic Constant Speed propeller. It's 4-bladed and it has a pitch range of 26 to 60 degrees. And that is powered, of course, by the Pratt & Whitney R2800-18 or -42 and W on each. So there is water injection in the engine as well. And it also features a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. You will also find Dash 4s with the Dash 48W engine of the R2800. However, that is a post-war modification just to allow the use of higher grade fuel. So I'm going to ignore that just here. This engine produces a whopping 2,100 Teddy Roosevelts at its highest setting. That would be 2,800 RPM and 60 inches of manifold pressure. But of course, for cruise, we're going to drop that down considerably to 2,100 RPMs and 33 inches on your manifold pressure. There's protection built in as well with a sort of a firewall armor for the rear compartment where you will find the water tank, 18 gallons. You will also find the oil tank, roughly 30 gallons there. And we have the fuel tank that is sitting in front of the pilot. That's the single fuel tank in the engine or in the aircraft, 230 gallons, and the pilot will get a warning at around 50 to 60 gallons that he's running low. There's deflection plating also on top of the fuel tank in order to protect it a little bit from incoming fire at steep angles from the front, and the tank is also self-sealing. Air intake right here also routes us directly to the intercooler, and as I'm talking about engine cooling, of course, this is an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, which means that you have to keep an eye on your cylinder head temperatures. You don't want to be above 245 degrees Celsius, and you have the cowl flaps here in order to manage that. And they are also spring-loaded, which means that if you're going faster than 317 knots, they open automatically to relieve the engine pressure that is building up with that oncoming air in the airstream and eject it this way. We have a bundled exhaust here as well, and then we have the intercooler outlet flap right here. Air intake for the supercharger on this side of the wing root, and then we have the oil cooler set right there, and that is mirrored on the left-hand side as well. Moving then forward along the leading edge, we find the gear. Now, the gear in a Corsair is really cool because you don't just land on it, you also lower it to act as a dive brake. And on the first roughly 600 Corsairs that were built of the Dash 2 variety, you still had a separate lever inside the cockpit in order to lower just the front gear and not the tail wheel for dive bombing operations when you're going into, I don't know, a 60-degree dive in order to bomb some, well, in World War II, it would mainly have been Japanese ships or positions somewhere on an island. However, eventually they did away with that just to facilitate, easier production. And the single or the two levers, one for the dive brakes and one for the gear, became one single lever, and that was just to lower the gear, either for dive bombing or for landing. Same lever, cool stuff. Moving along, gun camera, and as always on Inside the Cockpit, we're going to talk about the weaponry at the end, but you can already see the provisions here for your 50s. Walking along the leading edge, we have recognition lights mounted right here on the underside, navigational lighting here, moving and swinging ourselves around the wingtip, a handhold here, which is actually spring-loaded, Yeah, they don't make those anymore. I can tell you that for a fact. And then we have the aileron with a trim tab here as well. And the trim tab actually moves as you're deflecting the aileron in order to relieve some of that stress on the pilot, especially at higher speeds, and retain that controllability when you're going into the speed ranges where otherwise you would be suffering from a little bit of compression. Flaps. Now we have essentially 2 sets of flaps, but you might as well say 3 sets of flaps. The outboard one here, the inner section or the central section here, and then the inner section there, although these are basically connected. They deflect up to 50 degrees and can be lowered in 10-degree intervals. And what's also cool on the Corsair, and you see this on a bunch of aircraft, generally speaking, is that they do feature a sort of an aerodynamic blowback. So if you're going above 110 knots, they start retracting themselves, which is really cool when you're on a carrier, for example, you're coming in on a landing approach, you try to land, you may not hit that wire, or you have to go on a go-around, you're being waved off, right? Then you throttle up. You don't really have to manage the flaps. You can just keep on flying, and the flaps sort of will manage themselves a little bit as you're staying around the speeds that you are on your final circuit and then coming in for the landing. So that's really cool and makes it easy. We also have, of course, a wing fold. Since this is a carrier aircraft, and you can see right there the sort of locking mechanism, and this is spring-loaded as well. So if the wing is unlocked, that would be open. It can only be closed if the locking pin is actually in place. Wing fold on the Corsair happens hydraulically with a hand pump backup as well. Moving then towards the cockpit, we will have a look at that in just a second, but in order to get on it, you have the spring-loaded footrests here as well on either side, and you have handholds here as well in order then to mount onto the wing. The back of the aircraft, let's talk about construction a little bit. It is American, so semi-monocoque is the way to go. And we have a weight of empty, 9,000 pounds, and fully loaded, 15,000 pounds there. Moving towards the tail, we have a retractable and swiveling tail wheel, because this is a tail dragger, and there's also an arrestor hook that is also retractable, and both of them do work hydraulically. Let's talk about the tail then, or rather the horizontal and the vertical stabilizer. You have, of course, a big elevator with that as well, and these are interchangeable on either side, so you just have to swap them around, and there you go, completely interchangeable. And you also see that large rudder that hooks over the vertical stabilizer, and you have a trim tab there. And now allow me to do some yoga as we are going below the horizontal stabilizer of the Hellcat, which we're also filming here at the North England Air Museum. Josh just banged his head, well done. And you're right? You're okay, you're good. And we have trim tabs right here. As you can see, they are actually 2-piece trim tabs with the controlling actuator being above and below, just mirrored on either side, with a slight difference there if you're just looking at it straight on, because of that redundancy that is put in place for the design in order to facilitate easy maintenance and changing of elevators. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the aircraft on this side, because I want to point out the mechanisms here also for the wing fold. This is how it would look, and we have the gun cartridge ejection ports right here, which is really cool to see. Bringing it around then towards the front of the aircraft, let's talk weapons, right? So the Corsair, in its current configuration, as you see here, doesn't have weapons. This was the first Corsair -4 that was built, so there was no need to weapons. They were doing flight testing with this machine. But what you could have is 350s on either wing with 400 rounds per gun. Although I do find sometimes references to manuals that say the outer guns only have 375 rounds, but that the bird itself has 2,400 rounds, which, if you do the math, you're 50 rounds short, which is strange. But hey, sometimes manuals say strange things. It's just how it is. What you could also have is 2 20 mil cannons on either side. Some -4s have that, with roughly 800 rounds shared between the guns, which is a lot of good, strong firepower there as well, and can also be used, both the 50s and of course the 20s can be used really well to suppress, for example, anti-aircraft fire from ships, especially the lighter cargo ships, where the Allies and the Americans were doing a lot of targeting of Japanese shipping in the Pacific, and 50s and 20s would do a good job of suppressing sort of the flak on these ships in order then for other planes to come in and commence bombing or even torpedo operations. And of course on strafing runs against Japanese positions in the Pacific on the islands, these weapons would also be quite useful. Beyond that, of course, the Corsair can load bombs and rockets. On the wings, we can have like 8 H-4 rockets, and then bombs we also can have centerline bombs, in fact, up to 1,000 pounds, and then on the wings as well, up to 1,000 pounds. And that brings us to the end on the outside. So now we will have the joy of jumping inside this bird, the first Dash 4. And what do you say? Are you ready for this? Yeah, I definitely am. So let's go. One take.
Let's jump into the Corsair. As always, we go from left to right in one sweeping motion and then finishes off with the flight stick. To the far left, we find our emergency release for external stores, and then the wing fold lever and locking pin release. Towards the seat, the tail wheel lock and a storage case, for example, for charts. Moving forward, the trim settings. First up, we have the yaw trim, and then the big offset flywheel to the side, that's for the nose or, well, pitch trim. Outboard, the activation switch for the water injection system if you want to go faster. Moving forward, we have the roll trim control wheel set before the fuel tank selectors. Then we have a lot of levels here on the throttle quadrant. The white handle is for the supercharger gear. The big one is a throttle, and it has a big prominent switch on top. That's your press to talk button. With the throttle, you also activate the water injection if the switch that I showed you previously was set to on. For this, you have to activate a micro switch by just pushing the throttle through, almost as if you were going into afterburner on a modern jet. The smaller lever is your RPM control, and then the prominent red one, that's the mixture control. Moving forward to the front left panel, the flap lever is on the left, while the prominent red handle is for the carrier arrestor hook. To the right, the gear handle. Visual indicators for the landing and tail wheel round off this section, although on top of this panel you will also find the cowl flap control switch. Then the main instruments. Before we get to those, let's look to the left. Here we find the oxygen flow indicator, and then offset the cylinder head pressure indicator. Likely this is a relic of this very aircraft being a test aircraft for various engines. Then on the left column, working our way downwards, a heading and directional indicator, followed by an accelerometer and the ignition switches. We then have the engine RPMs. It's interesting actually to see these dials on the left and not the right side, but when the Corsair came out, it was still a period with less standardization across the board with different manufacturers. Then the main instruments. In the middle we have an artificial horizon and a compass. This is flanked on the left, top to bottom, with a speedometer and knots, an altimeter and the manifold pressure gauge. Flanking on the right, a rate of climb indicator, the turn and slip indicator, as well as a triple oil temperature and oil and fuel pressure indicator. On the right, you'll find your clock, and that's followed by a salvo selector for rockets, and then you have the cylinder head and fuel quantity indicator. Moving our head upwards, the reflector gun sight, and on the canopy we also find some mirrors for rearward visibility. Let's look downwards now. Between the rudder pedals we find another panel. The top two switches are to charge or secure the guns. Below the switch we find the oil and intercooler flaps with a visual position indicator as well. A hydraulic pressure indicator sits above this, and then you have the emergency landing gear release. To the left of the pilot on the floor, an emergency hand pump. Alright, now we move to the right hand side. First up we have the canopy control wheel, and then on the panel itself we have a voltmeter for the electric system, as well as the main battery and starter switches, and this is followed by switches for all the major electrically powered systems. And behind that, controls for the radio direction finding, and nominally also the IFF. Now the aircraft is of course controlled via the rudder pedals in the yaw axis, and then for roll and pitch we have the stick. On top of the stick we have the release button for bombs, drop tanks and rockets, and then in the conventional position we have the trigger for the guns. And that is the Corsair. As always, a big thank you to the New England Air Museum for hosting us, and also a reminder that please go and visit museums just like the New England Air Museum in your area, because that is what keeps them alive. And if you do go there, do say hi from us. Big thank you as well to all the patrons and channel members who make this content possible. Supporters already have access to a lot more videos like this one, and as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.